The sun was setting over the city of Chicago, casting long shadows across the parking lot of a busy supermarket. Cars moved in and out of spaces, their headlights flickering as shoppers hurried to finish their errands before night fell. Inside the store, the aisles were crowded with people grabbing last-minute items, groceries, snacks, household supplies. Among them was Officer Daniel Hayes, a man in his late 40s with graying hair and a stern expression etched onto his face. Even though he wasn't on duty, he still wore his police badge clipped to his belt, a habit he'd never broken. His sidearm rested snugly in its holster, a constant reminder of the authority he carried wherever he went. Daniel pushed his cart down the cereal aisle, scanning the shelves without much interest. He wasn't one for small talk or idle browsing. Shopping was just another task to check off his list. As he reached for a box of oatmeal, something caught his eye. A woman standing near the end of the aisle, talking quietly to an employee. She looked young, maybe in her late 20s, with dark skin and curly hair pulled back into a ponytail. She wore jeans and a plain jacket, nothing unusual, but there was something about her demeanor that made Daniel pause. She didn't seem like the type who belonged here, not in this part of town anyway. This was a neighborhood where most people looked like him, white, working class, familiar. But she stood out, her presence almost jarring against the backdrop of the fluorescent lights and neatly stacked shelves. Daniel frowned, his grip tightening, on the handle of his cart. He told himself it was curiosity, not suspicion, that made him linger. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woman gestured toward the security cameras mounted high on the walls, pointing at one in particular. The employee nodded, scribbling something on a clipboard before walking away. Daniel's frown deepened. What was she doing? Why was she asking about the cameras? His mind raced through possibilities, each more alarming than the last. Maybe she was casing the place, looking for weaknesses to exploit later. Or worse, maybe she was involved in something bigger, something criminal. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. It wasn't uncommon for people to ask questions in stores. Employees dealt with customers all the time, but something about her mannerisms struck him as calculated, deliberate. And then there was the way she carried herself, confident, almost too confident. That kind of confidence could mean only one thing. She had something to hide. Before he realized what he was doing, Daniel found himself moving closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, pretending to examine a display of canned goods while keeping one eye on her. When she turned slightly, he noticed a small pin attached to her jacket. At first glance, it looked like some sort of insignia, but he couldn't make out the details from where he stood. Whatever it was, it didn't belong to any organization he recognized. His heart began to pound in his chest. "Excuse me," he said suddenly, his voice sharp enough to startle her. She turned to face him, her eyebrows raised in surprise. Up close, he saw that her eyes were sharp and intelligent, assessing him in a way that made him feel uneasy. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Yes?" she asked finally, her tone polite but guarded. "I couldn't help but notice you talking to that employee," Daniel said, his words coming out faster than he intended. "What exactly were you asking about?" The woman blinked, clearly taken aback by his question. "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" she replied, her voice calm but firm. "There might be," Daniel shot back, his distrust spilling over into irritation. "You're asking about the cameras. That seems suspicious." A flicker of amusement crossed her face, quickly replaced by a look of mild annoyance. "Suspicious? I'm just gathering information for work," she explained, pulling the pin from her jacket and holding it up for him to see. It was a badge, small, unassuming, but unmistakably official. "I'm Agent Nicole Grant with the FBI. If you have concerns, feel free to call my office." Daniel stared at the badge, his jaw tightening. "FBI?" The words hit him like a punch to the gut. No, it couldn't be real. People like her didn't work for the FBI. They didn't walk into neighborhoods like this and act like they owned the place. He narrowed his eyes, refusing to believe her. "That's convenient," he muttered under his breath. Anyone can print up a fake badge these days. Nicole sighed, clearly growing impatient. Look, officer, she started, glancing at his badge clipped to his belt. Hayes, right? I don't know what your issue is, but I'm not impersonating anyone. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. She turned to leave, but Daniel stepped forward, blocking her path. Not so fast, he snapped, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the grip of his holstered gun. If you're really who you say you are, prove it. Show me some ID. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Around them, curious shoppers pausing mid-aisle to watch the confrontation unfold. Nicole hesitated, her gaze flicking between Daniel and the growing audience. She knew better than to escalate the situation further, especially with someone as volatile as him. But she also knew she couldn't back down, not when her authority was being challenged so blatantly. Fine, she said after a moment, reaching into her pocket. But let me remind you, Officer Hayes, that pointing a weapon at a federal agent is a felony offense. Are you sure you want to go down this road? Her words hung in the air, sharp and pointed, but Daniel barely registered them. All he could focus on was the fact that she hadn't shown him any ID yet. To him, that was proof enough that she was lying. His fingers twitched against the holster, itching to draw his weapon and force her compliance. And then, without warning, he did. The sound of the gun clicking as it cleared the holster echoed through the aisle, freezing everyone in place. Nicole froze too, her hands raised halfway in surrender. Her expression shifted from frustration to disbelief, then to something colder, anger mixed with pity. Around them, phones were already out, recording every second of the encounter. Put the gun down, Officer Hayes, Nicole said evenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. You're making a mistake. But Daniel didn't listen. In his mind, he was justified, in control. He didn't see Nicole as a person anymore. He saw only a threat, a liar, someone who didn't deserve to stand where she was. The weight of the gun in his hand gave him a false sense of power, blinding him to the reality of the situation. Seconds stretched into minutes as the standoff continued. Shoppers whispered nervously, unsure whether to intervene or flee. Finally, Nicole broke the silence. This ends now, she said firmly, lowering her hands. You've already crossed a line. Don't make it worse. It was a gamble, calling his bluff, but it worked. Slowly, reluctantly, Daniel lowered the gun, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and shame. He opened his mouth to say something, to defend himself, to justify his actions, but no words came out. Instead, he took a step back, his shoulders slumping as the gravity of what he'd done began to sink in. As the crowd dispersed and the store manager rushed over to assess the situation, Nicole stood her ground, watching Daniel with a mixture of sadness and resolve. She knew this wasn't just about him. It was about everything he represented, every system and mindset that allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked. And as she slipped her badge back into her pocket, she made a silent vow to hold him accountable, not just for her sake, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. The incident would soon become national, news, sparking debates about race, policing, and accountability. But for now, in that quiet moment in the cereal aisle, it was simply two people staring at each other across a divide that neither fully understood, and perhaps never would. The supermarket incident didn't stay quiet for long. Within minutes, the videos recorded by shoppers began to spread like wildfire on social media. The shaky footage showed Officer Daniel Hayes drawing his gun on Agent Nicole Grant, her calm but firm demeanor contrasting sharply with his aggressive stance. People watched in disbelief as the confrontation unfolded, their reactions ranging from outrage to disgust. Comments flooded the internet, many calling Hayes' actions unacceptable and racist. Others defended him, claiming he was just doing his job or reacting to a perceived threat. Either way, the video went viral, sparking heated debates across the country. By the time Daniel left the supermarket, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the steering wheel of his car, he already knew things were bad. His phone buzzed nonstop with notifications, Texts from colleagues, missed calls from his wife, and angry messages from strangers. He ignored them all, trying to convince himself that it wasn't as serious as it seemed. "It'll blow over," he muttered under his breath, though even he didn't believe it. Deep down, he knew the damage had been done. Back at the supermarket, Nicole gave a brief statement to the store manager before stepping outside to call her supervisor. She leaned against the hood of her car, her mind racing as she replayed the events in her head. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her authority because of her race, but this time felt different. This time it had escalated to a level she never imagined. A loaded gun pointed directly at her chest. Her heart still raced at the memory, but she forced herself to stay focused. There was work to do. "Grant here," she said, when her supervisor answered. "We've got a situation. I'm at the Greenfield supermarket. An off-duty officer pulled a weapon on me while I was conducting routine surveillance." Her supervisor listened intently, asking for details before instructing her to file an official report immediately. "This is going to get messy," he warned. "Be prepared for scrutiny not just from the public but internally too. You sure you want to press charges?" Nicole hesitated only for a moment. "Yes," she replied firmly. "This isn't just about me. If we don't hold him accountable, it sends a message that this kind of behavior is okay, and it's not." Meanwhile, local law enforcement was scrambling to respond to the growing backlash. The police department issued a vague statement condemning the use of excessive force, but stopped short of taking sides. Behind closed doors, however, tensions ran high. Some officers argued that Hayes had acted within his rights, while others privately admitted they weren't surprised by his behavior. For years, there had been whispers about Hayes's attitude, his tendency to treat people differently based on their race or background, but no one had ever dared to confront him about it. Now those whispers were turning into shouts, amplified by the national spotlight. Later that evening, Hayes received a visit from 2 detectives assigned to investigate the incident. They arrived at his house unannounced, their expressions grim, as they knocked on his door. When he opened it, his face turned pale. "What do you want?" he asked gruffly, crossing his arms over his chest. "We need to ask you some questions about what happened at the supermarket today," one of the detectives said, holding up a badge. "Mind if we come in?" Hayes hesitated, glancing past them, toward the street where a neighbor stood watering her plants, clearly eavesdropping. Reluctantly, he stepped aside, letting them enter. The detectives wasted no time getting to the point. They asked him to recount the events leading up to the confrontation, probing for inconsistencies in his story. At first, Hayes stuck to his guns, literally and figuratively, insisting that he'd acted out of self-defense. "She didn't identify herself properly," he argued, pacing back and forth in his living room. "How was I supposed to know she was really FBI? Anyone can fake a badge these days." The detectives exchanged skeptical glances but didn't interrupt. They let him talk himself into a corner, his explanations becoming increasingly defensive and disjointed. By the end of the interview, it was clear that Hayes's version of events didn't match the evidence captured on video. As they prepared to leave, one of them handed him a summons to appear in court later that week. "You'll be hearing from us again," he said coldly. News of Hayes's impending trial dominated headlines over the next few days. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read "Justice for Nicole Grant" and "Accountability Now." Local activists organized rallies, demanding systemic changes to address racial bias in law enforcement. Even national news outlets picked up the story, framing it as yet another example of systemic racism in America. For Hayes, the pressure became unbearable. His phone wouldn't stop ringing, and his inbox overflowed with hate mail. Strangers showed up at his house, shouting insults and throwing eggs at his windows. His wife, Lisa, begged him to apologize, to admit he'd made a mistake, but Hayes refused. "I didn't do anything wrong," he insisted stubbornly. "They're twisting everything around." Lisa shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "You pointed a gun at someone, Dan, a federal agent. Do you have any idea how serious that is? You're destroying our lives." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. but he pushed them aside. Admitting fault wasn't an option. Not yet. Anyway. Instead, he hired a lawyer who specialized in defending police officers accused of misconduct. The lawyer, a wiry man named Frank Miller, assured Hayes that they could spin the narrative in their favor. "We'll argue reasonable suspicion," Miller explained during their first meeting. "You thought she was impersonating an officer. That gives you grounds for self-defense." But as the days passed, cracks began to form in Hayes's defense. Witnesses came forward, corroborating Nicole's account of the incident. Store employees testified that she had identified herself multiple times and even shown her badge. Surveillance footage backed up their statements, capturing every word of the heated exchange. Even Hayes's own colleagues distanced themselves from him, refusing to vouch for his character when questioned by investigators. As the trial date approached, Nicole found herself caught in a whirlwind of media attention. Reporters camped outside her apartment, eager to capture her reaction to the latest developments. Colleagues offered words of support, but some also urged caution. "This case is bigger than you," one of them warned. "People will try to make it about everything except the facts." Nicole nodded, understanding the weight of what was at stake. She spent hours preparing her testimony, rehearsing answers to potential questions from both the prosecution and defense. Despite the stress, she remained resolute. This wasn't just about her. It was about sending a message that abuse of power would not be tolerated no matter who committed it. On the morning of the trial, the courtroom was packed with spectators. Cameras flashed as Hayes entered, flanked by his lawyer and a pair of bailiffs. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the sea of faces staring back at him. Across the aisle, Nicole sat quietly, her expression unreadable. She avoided looking at Hayes, focusing instead on the judge as proceedings began. The prosecution opened with a powerful statement, laying out the facts of the case in stark detail. They presented video evidence, witness testimonies, and expert analysis showing that Hayes had acted recklessly and without justification. The defense countered with arguments about fear and uncertainty, painting Hayes as a man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. But their efforts fell flat against the overwhelming proof of his guilt. As the day wore on, Hayes grew increasingly agitated. He fidgeted in his seat, muttering under his breath whenever the prosecution scored a point. At one point, he leaned over to whisper something to his lawyer, but Miller silenced him with a sharp glance. By the time the session ended, Hayes looked exhausted, his confidence shattered. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Nicole, peppering her with questions about her thoughts on the trial so far. She kept her responses brief, reiterating her commitment to justice and accountability. When asked how she felt about Hayes, she paused, choosing her words carefully. "I feel sorry for him," she said finally. "Not because of what's happening now, but because of the choices that led him here. No one should live their life ruled by fear and prejudice." Her words resonated with many, further solidifying her role as a symbol of resilience and integrity. Inside, Hayes sat alone in a holding cell, reflecting on the mess he'd created. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. Had he really been wrong? Or was the world simply against him? The questions haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his conscience as the trial pressed on. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial entered its second week. The air was thick with tension, a mix of curiosity and anger hanging over the spectators who filled every available seat. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, their cameras clicking whenever someone important stood to speak. For Nicole Grant, sitting quietly at the prosecution's table, the days blurred together in a haze of testimony, evidence, and legal arguments. She tried to stay focused, reminding herself why she was here. Not just for justice, but for the countless others who had faced similar situations without the platform or support she now had. On the other side of the room, Daniel Hayes sat slumped, in his chair, his face pale and drawn. Gone was the arrogance he'd displayed during the supermarket incident. Now, he looked like a man clinging to whatever scraps of dignity he had left. His lawyer, Frank Miller, did his best to rally him, whispering encouragement and advice, but even Miller seemed less confident than before. The prosecution's case was strong, too strong, and the defense struggled to counter it effectively. Each day brought new witnesses to the stand. Store employees recounted how calm and professional Nicole had been, describing her clear identification as an FBI agent. One employee, a young man named Kevin, recalled Hayes' hostile tone and refusal to listen. He kept demanding proof, Kevin said, his voice steady despite the intensity of the moment. But Agent Grant showed him her badge right away. He just didn't want to believe her. Another witness, a shopper who had recorded part of the confrontation on her phone, described Hayes' escalating behavior. It felt dangerous, she testified, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. I thought something terrible was going to happen. Her video, played multiple times in court, became a centerpiece of the prosecution's argument. It showed Hayes drawing his gun, his movements jerky and aggressive, while Nicole remained composed, her hands raised in surrender. Frank Miller worked tirelessly to poke holes in these accounts, questioning the reliability of eyewitnesses and arguing that the video didn't tell the full story. My client acted out of fear, he insisted during his cross-examinations. He believed Agent Grant was impersonating an officer. In that moment, he thought he was protecting himself and others. But the judge and much of the jury seemed unconvinced. Every time Miller made his case, the prosecution countered with irrefutable evidence, surveillance footage from multiple angles, expert analysis confirming Nicole's credentials, and even internal police memos highlighting Hayes' history of discriminatory behavior. These documents revealed a pattern of complaints against Hayes, ranging from rude remarks to outright threats. Though none of these incidents had resulted in formal charges, they painted a damning picture of a man whose prejudices often clouded his judgment. As the trial progressed, Hayes began to unravel. During breaks, he paced nervously outside the courtroom, chain-smoking cigarettes and muttering under his breath. Once, when a reporter shouted a question about his feelings regarding the case, Hayes snapped. "You don't know me," he yelled, throwing his cigarette to the ground. "You don't know what it's like to deal with people like her." His outburst drew gasps from nearby reporters, and the footage quickly made its way online. Critics seized on the comment, interpreting it as further proof of Hayes' bias. Even some of his supporters began to distance themselves, realizing that defending him might do more harm than good. Back inside the courtroom, Nicole took the stand for the first time. Dressed in a simple navy blue suit, she exuded calmness and authority as she recounted the events of that day. Her voice was steady, her answers concise and direct. When asked about her reaction to Hayes' actions, she paused briefly before responding. "I was shocked," she admitted. "Not because I hadn't encountered racism before, I have, but because it happened so openly, in front of so many people. It wasn't just about me. It was about sending a message that certain individuals are above the law." Her words resonated deeply with the jury, several members nodding in agreement. The prosecutor followed up with questions designed to highlight Hayes' lack of justification for pulling his weapon. Nicole explained that she had identified herself repeatedly, shown her badge, and even offered to call her supervisor if Hayes doubted her legitimacy. There was no reason for him to escalate the situation, she concluded. None. When Frank Miller stepped up for cross-examination, he attempted to cast doubt on Nicole's credibility, suggesting that her status as an FBI agent gave her an unfair advantage in the encounter. "Isn't it true that you could have de-escalated the situation yourself?" he asked pointedly, "instead of letting it spiral out of control?" Nicole met his gaze without flinching. "De-escalation is always preferable," she replied. "But when someone draws a gun on you, your options become very limited. I did everything I could to avoid conflict, including complying with Officer Hayes' demands. Unfortunately, compliance wasn't enough for him." Miller pressed harder, asking whether Nicole harbored any personal animosity toward Hayes based on past experiences with law enforcement. Nicole shook her head firmly. "This isn't personal," she said. "It's about accountability. If we let this kind of behavior slide, we're telling everyone that it's okay to act out of prejudice and fear instead of facts." By the time Nicole stepped down from the stand, the tide had turned decisively in favor of the prosecution. Hayes's attempts to justify his actions sounded hollow in comparison to the mountain of evidence stacked against him. Even his own testimony, delivered haltingly and laced with contradictions, failed to sway the jury. At one point, he broke down in tears, claiming he never meant to hurt anyone. But sympathy for him was in short supply. Most people saw his remorse as too little, too late. Closing arguments came 2 days later. The prosecution delivered a powerful summary, emphasizing the importance of holding public servants accountable for their actions. Officer Hayes violated the trust placed in him by the community, the lead prosecutor declared. He let his biases dictate his behavior, and in doing so, he endangered the life of a federal agent. This court has the opportunity to send a message: no one is above the law. Frank Miller countered with an impassioned plea for leniency, portraying Hayes as a flawed but ultimately decent man who had made a tragic mistake. We all have moments of weakness, he argued. Should one bad decision define a person's entire life? Officer Hayes deserves a second chance, but his words fell flat. As the jury filed out of the courtroom to deliberate, it was clear that Hayes's fate rested not on technicalities, but on the overwhelming weight of his actions. After 6 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the judge read the decision aloud. Hayes sank into his chair, his face blank with shock. Nicole, meanwhile, allowed herself a small private smile, a fleeting acknowledgement of the hard-fought victory. The sentencing hearing took place a week later. Friends and family of both parties packed the courtroom, their emotions running high. Hayes's wife, Lisa, sat silently beside him, her eyes red from crying. Nicole's parents attended as well, offering quiet support from the front row. When given the opportunity to address the court, Hayes spoke hesitantly, apologizing for his actions but stopping short of admitting wrongdoing. "I hope someday people can understand where I was coming from," he said, his voice barely audible. Nicole chose to speak next. Standing tall, she addressed not only the judge but also the broader audience watching through live broadcasts. "Today isn't just about punishment," she began. "It's about change, about recognizing that fear and ignorance cannot excuse harm. We need to hold ourselves and each other to higher standards. That's how we build trust. That's how we move forward." The judge nodded solemnly before delivering the sentence: 3 years in prison, with the possibility of early release for good behavior. As bailiffs led Hayes away, Nicole watched silently, her expression unreadable. Outside the courthouse, cheers erupted from the crowd gathered to hear the verdict. For many, it was a long overdue step toward justice, but for Nicole, it was simply another chapter in a much larger fight, one she knew would continue long after the headlines faded. Daniel Hayes stepped into the cold, gray world of prison life with a heavy heart and a sense of disbelief. The walls of the correctional facility loomed over him like a fortress, their concrete surfaces stained and cracked from years of wear. It was a far cry from the tidy streets of his old neighborhood or the familiarity of his patrol car. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt powerless, stripped not only of his freedom, but also of the authority he had once taken for granted. His arrival at the facility was chaotic. Guards barked orders as new inmates shuffled through metal detectors and handed over personal belongings. Daniel clutched a small plastic bag containing the few items allowed: a toothbrush, a bar of soap, and a pair of standard-issue clothes. As he stood in line waiting to be processed, he couldn't help but notice the stares. Some were curious, others hostile, but all carried a weight that made him uneasy. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of judgment. It had always been the other way around. Once inside his cell, Daniel sat on the thin mattress covering the steel bunk bed, staring blankly at the peeling paint on the opposite wall. The space was cramped and smelled faintly of mildew. His cellmate, a wiry man named Marcus Reed, leaned against the bars watching him with sharp eyes. Marcus had been in the system for years, serving time for armed robbery, and he wasted no time sizing up the newcomer. "So you're the cop, huh?" Marcus said finally, his voice low and mocking. "The one who pulled a gun on a Fed. Big move, man, real smart." Daniel stiffened but didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to speak without losing his temper, and besides, what could he Say? Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, I thought so. You cops always think you're untouchable until you end up in here. Welcome to the real world, Officer Hayes. The days that followed were a blur of monotony and tension. Breakfast was served at dawn, a tray of tasteless oatmeal and watery coffee, and inmates were herded into workshops or exercise yards for a few hours before returning to their cells. Daniel struggled to adapt. He missed the structure of his old life, the routine of patrols and reports. Here, everything felt unpredictable, dangerous even. Every glance, every whispered conversation seemed loaded with hidden meaning. Word of Daniel's identity spread quickly among the inmates. They called him Officer Bigot, a nickname that stuck like glue. Some taunted him openly, hurling insults about his crime and his attitude. Others simply ignored him, treating him like an outsider unworthy of respect. Even the guards, many of whom resented his arrogance, gave him little sympathy. One guard, a burly man named Carter, went out of his way to make Daniel's life miserable, assigning him extra chores or leaving him locked in his cell longer than necessary. Despite the hostility, Daniel tried to keep his head down. He avoided confrontations, focusing instead on surviving each day. But survival came at a cost. Sleep eluded him, haunted by dreams of the supermarket incident and the faces of those who had judged him. During waking hours, he replayed the trial, in his mind, dissecting every moment, searching for something, anything he might have done differently. Had he really been wrong? Or was the world just determined to punish him for standing his ground? One afternoon during recreation time, tensions boiled over. Daniel was sitting alone on a bench trying to stay out of trouble when Marcus approached him. "You hear me talking to you, Hayes?" Marcus demanded, his tone sharper this time. "I asked if you've got any smokes." Daniel shook his head. "No," he muttered, keeping his eyes fixed on the ground. Marcus sneered, grabbing Daniel by the collar and yanking him to his feet. "Listen up, cop. Around here, we don't ignore people. You got that?" Before Daniel could react, another inmate shouted, drawing the attention of nearby guards. The commotion escalated into a scuffle, with punches flying and bodies colliding. By the time the guards broke it up, both Daniel and Marcus were bloodied and bruised. The punishment was swift: solitary confinement for Daniel, a week in isolation, to cool off. Solitary was worse than anything Daniel had imagined. The tiny cell was completely bare, its only feature a narrow slit in the door for food trays. There was no window, no clock, just 4 suffocating walls and the sound of his own breathing. Hours stretched into days, each one blending into the next. Without distractions, his thoughts turned inward, forcing him to confront the choices that had led him here. For the first time, Daniel began to question his beliefs. Was he truly the victim of a biased system, as he'd convinced himself during the trial? Or had his actions stemmed from something deeper, something uglier? Memories surfaced unbidden. The times he'd dismissed complaints from minority residents, the jokes he'd laughed at with colleagues, the subtle ways he'd let prejudice creep into his decisions. He had always told himself he wasn't racist, that he treated everyone equally. But now those excuses felt hollow. By the end of the week, Daniel emerged from solitary a changed man, or so it seemed. His face was thinner, his posture more subdued. When he returned to the general population, he kept to himself, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when spoken to. Some inmates interpreted this as weakness, continuing to mock him, while others noted the shift in his demeanor. Marcus, however, remained skeptical. "You trying to play nice now, Hayes?" Marcus asked one evening as they sat in their shared cell. "Or are you just scared?" Daniel hesitated, unsure how to respond. Finally, he said quietly, "Maybe both." Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the honesty. "Well, don't get soft on me," he warned. "This place doesn't reward weakness." As the weeks passed, Daniel found himself reflecting more deeply on his past. Letters from home arrived sporadically, mostly from his wife, Lisa. At first, she wrote angrily, accusing him of ruining their lives with his stubbornness. But as time went on, her tone softened. She confessed that she still loved him but couldn't reconcile the man she married with the person revealed during the trial. Eventually, she stopped writing altogether, leaving Daniel to wonder if she had moved on without him. Without Lisa's support, Daniel turned to the letters he received from strangers. Most were hateful, filled with vitriol and accusations, but a few offered words of encouragement. One letter, unsigned, stood out. It read, "Change starts with admitting you were wrong. Don't waste this chance." Though unsigned, the message resonated with Daniel, planting a seed of hope in his otherwise bleak existence. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, Nicole Grant continued her work with renewed purpose. The trial had brought her national recognition, making her a symbol of resilience and justice. She traveled frequently, giving speeches at conferences and community events, advocating for reforms in law enforcement. Her efforts earned praise from activists and critics alike, though not everyone agreed with her methods. Some accused her of exploiting the incident for publicity, while others questioned whether systemic change was truly possible. Despite the backlash, Nicole remained steadfast. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she refused to give up. Each speech, each meeting, reinforced her belief that accountability was the first step toward healing. And yet, as much as she focused on the bigger picture, she couldn't forget the man whose actions had sparked it all. Late at night, lying awake in her apartment, she sometimes wondered what Daniel Hayes was doing, whether he regretted his choices or remained defiant. Back in prison, Daniel faced another challenge: forgiveness. Not from others, but from himself. He began attending counseling sessions offered by the facility, hesitant at first but gradually opening up about his feelings of guilt and shame. The counselor, a kind woman named Dr. Alvarez, encouraged him to explore the roots of his behavior. "It's not about excusing what you did," she explained gently. "It's about understanding why you did it so you can make better choices moving forward." Daniel nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. Could someone like him really change? Could he ever earn forgiveness, not just from society, but from himself? As months passed, Daniel's transformation became more apparent. He started volunteering for tasks within the prison, helping organize educational programs, and mentoring younger inmates. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. Some guards even remarked on his improved attitude. Though he still faced hostility from certain inmates, he handled it with a calmness that surprised even himself. One day, as he sorted books in the prison library, Daniel came across a biography of Martin Luther King Jr. Curious, he flipped through its pages, reading about King's philosophy of nonviolence and forgiveness. Something about the words struck a chord deep within him. Maybe redemption wasn't impossible after all. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to rebuild, not just his life, but his character. The journey wouldn't be easy, and Daniel knew he had a long way to go. But for the first time since entering prison, he felt a glimmer of hope. A fragile, flickering light in the darkness. Whether it would grow strong enough to guide him out remained to be seen. But for now it was enough to keep him moving forward, one tentative step at a time. 2 years into his sentence, Daniel Hayes had become a different man, or at least that was what he told himself. The changes were subtle, but undeniable. He no longer flinched at the sound of footsteps echoing down the prison hallway or tensed up when inmates whispered his name. His temper, once quick to flare, had softened under the weight of self-reflection and the monotony of prison life. He spent most of his days in the library, organizing books and helping other inmates with their reading. It wasn't much, but it gave him a sense of purpose, a small way to make amends for the harm he'd caused. Dr. Alvarez, the counselor who had guided him through some of his darkest moments, noticed the shift. "You've come a long way," she said during one of their sessions. "But healing isn't just about fixing yourself, it's about repairing what you broke." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He knew she was right. No matter how much he changed inside these walls, the people he had hurt wouldn't forget what he'd done. Nicole Grant's face often appeared in his thoughts, haunting him like a ghost. She had been calm and composed during their encounter, even as he had acted out of anger and fear. What right did he have to expect forgiveness from someone like her? Still, something inside Daniel pushed him to try. Late one night, after everyone else in his cell block had fallen asleep, he sat at the tiny desk by his bunk and began writing a letter. His handwriting was shaky at first, the pen trembling in his hand as he struggled to find the right words. How could he possibly express the depth of his regret? After several false starts, he finally settled on a simple message. Dear Agent Grant, I know saying sorry won't change what happened that day, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I've thought a lot about my actions and how they affected you. I let my fears and biases cloud my judgment, and I nearly hurt someone because of it. That's not who I want to be. I'm not asking for anything. Not your trust, not your understanding. I just needed to say this because keeping it inside feels heavier than staying silent. If there's anything I can do to make things right, please let me know. Even if you never respond, I hope someday you'll see that I mean it. I'm truly sorry. Sincerely, Daniel Hayes. When he finished, Daniel folded the letter carefully and tucked it into an envelope. He didn't address it yet. He wasn't sure he had the courage to send it. For now, it felt enough just to write it, to admit aloud what he had refused to acknowledge for so long. Outside the prison walls, Nicole Grant was building a new chapter of her own life. Her work as an advocate for law enforcement reform had gained momentum, drawing attention from lawmakers, activists, and ordinary citizens alike. She traveled across the country, speaking at conferences, meeting with community leaders, and pushing for policies aimed at addressing racial bias in policing. Each speech reinforced her belief that accountability was the cornerstone of progress. But it also reminded her of the resistance she faced. Not everyone agreed with her vision. Some accused her of being too idealistic, arguing that systemic change was impossible. Others dismissed her efforts as performative, claiming she cared more about headlines than results. Nicole heard the criticisms loud and clear, but she refused to let them deter her. Change is hard, she often said in interviews, but it's necessary. And if we don't start somewhere, nothing will ever improve. Amid the whirlwind of speeches and meetings, Nicole found solace in quieter moments. She spent weekends volunteering at youth centers in underserved neighborhoods, mentoring kids who dreamed of careers in law enforcement. Many of them looked up to her, inspired by her story of resilience. Yet Nicole never lost sight of the fact that her journey hadn't been easy, and neither would theirs. One evening, as she sorted through a stack of mail in her apartment, she came across an unfamiliar envelope. The return address listed a correctional facility, and her stomach tightened as she recognized the name, Daniel Hayes. For a moment, she considered tossing it aside unread. Why should she give him the satisfaction of knowing she'd received it? But curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it cautiously. As she read the letter, her expression shifted from skepticism to surprise. The words were humble, sincere. Nothing like the defensive arguments he'd made during the trial. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as a ploy, a calculated attempt to win sympathy, but another part of her couldn't ignore the raw honesty in his apology. By the time she reached the end, she felt conflicted. Should she respond? Or should she let the letter fade into silence, just as he had suggested? Nicole set the letter aside and stared out the window, her mind racing. Forgiveness wasn't something she could offer lightly, not when it represented so much more than one man's regret. This wasn't just about Daniel Hayes, it was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. Still, she couldn't deny that his words carried weight. Maybe redemption wasn't a zero-sum game. Maybe holding on to anger would only perpetuate the cycle of pain. She decided against replying immediately. Instead, she tucked the letter into a drawer, promising herself she'd revisit it later. For now, she focused on the work ahead, on the countless others who still needed her voice. Meanwhile, Daniel's life continued to evolve behind bars. His newfound dedication to self-improvement earned him early release eligibility, a decision announced during a routine parole hearing. The news came as a shock, He hadn't expected to leave prison before completing his full sentence. When the parole board explained that his behavior and participation in rehabilitation programs had influenced their decision, Daniel felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Freedom sounded appealing, but the idea of re-entering a world that despised him filled him with dread. His wife, Lisa, had filed for divorce shortly after his imprisonment, leaving him without a home or support system upon release. Friends from his old life had distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with a disgraced officer. As his release date approached, Daniel realized he'd have to start over completely. With Dr. Alvarez's help, he secured a job at a local community center, a modest position as a janitor, but one that provided stability and anonymity. On the day of his release, Daniel stepped out of the prison gates wearing borrowed clothes and carrying a single duffel bag. The sunlight felt strange on his face, almost foreign after years of artificial lighting. He took a deep breath, savoring the crisp air, and reminded himself that this was a second chance, a fragile opportunity to rewrite his story. The community center where Daniel worked was located in a bustling neighborhood, its walls covered in colorful murals depicting scenes of unity and hope. At first, residents eyed him warily, unsure what to make of the quiet man mopping floors and emptying trash bins. Rumors spread quickly about his past, and some parents pulled their children out of programs hosted at the center, fearing his presence might pose a risk. But Daniel didn't complain. He understood their mistrust. Earning it back would take time. He threw himself into his work, arriving early each morning and staying late to ensure the building was spotless. Slowly, his diligence began to win over skeptics. One woman, a volunteer named Clara, struck up conversations with him during breaks, sharing stories about her grandchildren and asking about his interests. Though Daniel remained guarded, he appreciated the kindness, a rare commodity in his current life. Despite the glimmers of acceptance, reminders of his past lingered. News outlets occasionally revisited his case, using it as a cautionary tale about prejudice and abuse of power. Social media comments ranged from vitriolic insults to calls for stricter accountability in law enforcement. Daniel avoided the coverage as much as possible, knowing it would only reopen old wounds. Still, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was living under a microscope, constantly judged for mistakes he was trying to leave behind. One afternoon, while cleaning the center's multi-purpose room, Daniel overheard a group of teenagers rehearsing a play. They were performing a scene about racial profiling, and though the dialogue was fictional, it hit uncomfortably close to home. Daniel froze, gripping the mop handle tightly as guilt washed over him. He considered slipping away quietly, but one of the teens noticed him standing there. "Hey, mister," the boy called out, waving him over. "What do you think? Pretty good, huh?" Daniel hesitated, then forced a smile. "Yeah, it's great. You guys are talented." The compliment seemed to catch them off guard, and they exchanged curious glances before returning to their rehearsal. As Daniel resumed his cleaning, he realized how far he still had to go, not just in proving himself to others, but in forgiving himself. Redemption wasn't a destination, it was a journey, one step at a time. Back in her apartment, Nicole revisited Daniel's letter. She had kept it tucked away for weeks, unsure how to process its contents. Now, sitting alone in her living room, she reread it carefully, her mind clearer than before. While she still harbored doubts about his sincerity, she couldn't deny the potential impact of his apology. If someone as flawed as Daniel Hayes could confront his biases and seek growth, perhaps there was hope for others too. Taking a pen, Nicole jotted down a brief response. "Mr. Hayes, I received your letter. I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet anyway. But I respect your willingness to acknowledge your mistakes. Keep working toward becoming the person you want to be. That's all any of us can do." The months passed and life moved forward for both Nicole Grant and Daniel Hayes. For Nicole, the pace was relentless. Her advocacy work continued to grow, drawing invitations to speak at events across the country. She stood on stages large and small, her voice steady as she shared stories of resilience and called for systemic change. Each speech felt like planting a seed, small actions that might one day grow into something larger. But even amid the applause and admiration, Nicole carried a quiet burden. The scars of the past weren't easily erased, and though she had learned to live with them, they still lingered beneath the surface. Daniel, meanwhile, navigated his new reality with cautious steps. Life outside prison was harder than he'd imagined. The janitor job at the community center paid little, but it gave him structure, a routine he desperately needed after years of confinement. He kept to himself mostly, avoiding conversations about his past unless pressed. When people asked why he had ended up in prison, he offered vague answers, saying only that he had made mistakes and was working to fix them. Some believed him. Others didn't care enough to dig deeper. At the community center, Daniel found solace in the murals painted on the walls. Their bright colors and hopeful messages reminded him of how far he had come and how much farther he still had to go. One mural in particular caught his eye, a tree with deep roots stretching into the ground, its branches reaching toward the sky. Beneath it were the words, "Growth begins with honesty." Daniel often paused to look at it, letting the message sink in. Clara, the volunteer who had befriended him, noticed his fondness for the mural. "You like that one?" she asked one afternoon as they cleaned up after a youth program. Daniel nodded. "It's true, isn't it? You can't move forward without being honest about where you've been." Clara smiled softly. "Sounds like you're figuring things out." "Trying to," Daniel admitted. "Some days it feels like I'm climbing uphill. Other days, I don't know. Maybe I'm getting somewhere." Clara didn't press him further. Instead, she handed him a broom and changed the subject, chatting about her plans for the weekend. Small talk came easily to her, and Daniel appreciated her effort to keep things light. Over time, their friendship became a source of comfort for him, a reminder that not everyone saw him as irredeemable. One morning, Daniel arrived at the community center to find an envelope waiting for him at the front desk. His name was scrawled across it in neat handwriting, and his heart skipped a beat when he recognized the return address, Nicole Grant. He stared at the envelope for a long moment, unsure whether to open it. What if her response was harsh? What if she rejected his apology outright? Taking a deep breath, Daniel tore open the envelope and unfolded the note inside. As he read Nicole's words, a wave of emotions washed over him. Relief, gratitude, and a lingering sense of guilt. Her message was brief but powerful, acknowledging his effort without excusing his past. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something close to understanding. And for now, that was enough. Daniel tucked the note into his pocket and went about his day, mopping floors and wiping down tables as usual. But his mind kept returning to Nicole's words. Keep working toward becoming the person you want to be. It wasn't just advice, it was permission to keep going, to believe that change was possible. That evening, Daniel sat alone in his tiny apartment, staring at the note again. He thought about writing back, thanking Nicole for her response, but decided against it. Some things didn't need to be said aloud. Instead, he pulled out a notebook and began jotting down thoughts, reflections on his journey, lessons he had learned, and goals he hoped to achieve. Writing helped him process his emotions, turning abstract feelings into concrete ideas. By the time he finished, he felt lighter, as though he had taken another step toward healing. Nicole received no reply from Daniel, nor did she expect one. She had sent her note with no expectation of closure, simply wanting to acknowledge his effort. Still, she couldn't help but wonder what had become of him. Had he truly changed? Or was his apology just a fleeting moment of regret? These questions lingered in her mind, but she pushed them aside, focusing instead on the bigger picture. Her work brought her to a national conference on criminal justice reform, where she delivered a keynote speech to a packed auditorium. Standing at the podium, she scanned the sea of faces before beginning her remarks. "Change is hard," she said, her voice strong and clear. "It requires us to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about others, but about ourselves. It demands accountability, humility, and a willingness to listen, to As she spoke, Nicole reflected on her own experiences, the challenges she had faced and the progress she had witnessed. She talked about Daniel Hayes briefly, framing his story as an example of how accountability could lead to growth. Not everyone will take responsibility for their actions, she said. But when they do, we owe it to ourselves and to them to recognize the courage it takes to admit fault. That doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means choosing to believe that people can change. The audience erupted in applause, but Nicole's thoughts remained focused on the road ahead. Change wouldn't happen overnight, and setbacks were inevitable. But every step mattered, no matter how small. Years later, Daniel Hayes had built a modest but meaningful life for himself. He still worked at the community center, though he had taken on additional responsibilities, mentoring young people interested in law enforcement. His past remained a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He spoke openly about his mistakes, using his story to teach others about the dangers of prejudice and unchecked authority. One evening, while attending a local event honoring community leaders, Daniel spotted Nicole Grant across the room. She was surrounded by admirers, her presence commanding attention. For a moment, he considered approaching her but hesitated, unsure if she would remember him or want to speak with him. Before he could decide, Clara nudged him gently. "Go say hi," she urged. "You never know." Summoning his courage, Daniel walked over to Nicole, stopping a respectful distance away. "Agent Grant?" he said quietly. Nicole turned, her expression unreadable at first. Then recognition dawned, and she studied him carefully. "Mr. Hayes," she replied, her tone neutral. "How are you?" "I'm doing better," Daniel said, fumbling slightly over his words. "I just wanted to thank you for your letter. It meant a lot to me." Nicole nodded slowly, her gaze softening. "You've done good work here," she said after a pause. "I've heard about the programs you've helped start. It's impressive." The compliment caught Daniel off guard, and he struggled to respond. "Thank you," he managed finally. "I'm trying to make a difference, even if it's small." "It's not small," Nicole said firmly. "Every action matters. Keep going." With that, she excused herself, disappearing into the crowd. Daniel watched her go, feeling a mix of gratitude and resolve. Their interaction had been brief, but it carried weight. A quiet acknowledgement of how far they had both come. In the years that followed, Daniel continued his work at the community center, expanding its outreach programs and inspiring others to pursue careers rooted in service and integrity. Nicole, too, remained steadfast in her mission, advocating for reforms that challenged systemic inequities. Though their paths rarely crossed, they shared a common goal: building a world where accountability and empathy coexisted. Neither Daniel nor Nicole ever forgot the events that had brought them together, or the lessons they had learned along the way. Redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey, marked by moments of struggle and triumph. And while the scars of the past would always remain, they served as reminders of the resilience required to heal, and the courage needed to move forward. As the sun set on another day, Daniel stood outside the community center, gazing at the mural of the tree once more. Its message resonated deeply within him, echoing the words Nicole had written so many years ago. Growth began with honesty, and honesty led to hope. And hope, no matter how fragile, was worth holding on to.